Good evening. We are live.
We are live.
We are live. Welcome everyone. And here this evening we got two exceptional guests. We are on the 68th episode of the it sounds actually awful in English, so I'm going to say it in Italian, pub del lunedì sera, because we haven't figured out a cool way to say it in Italian.
Monday night pub. Monday night pub.
Okay, fine. So this evening we're going to we discuss about IQ and intelligence, and we have here the honor to have with us to discuss about this topic Professor Russell Warne from the Utah Valley University. Welcome, and thank you very much for accepting the invitation, Professor.
Thanks for having me.
And we also have the honor to have back, great comeback, Professor Marco Del Giudice from New Mexico University. Thank you very much, Marco, for coming back. As I said, we're going to talk about IQ and intelligence, and we have sponsored this episode quite a lot. So Professor Warne is the author of a very interesting book, which is called In the Know, debunking 35 myths regarding human intelligence. And fantastic. It's a super interesting book. I started reading it and I found it fascinating. So I would highly recommend it to everyone who's actually following us today. So I will start from the very basics. Actually, my very first question is from the basics. So I mean, as Marco knows and Maria Paola knows, that I have sort of a background in neuroscience, in the sense that I work as a neurosurgeon. I'm doing a PhD. I'm attempting to pursue an academic career now. And I was actually fascinated by how many things I actually don't know about the intelligence. Even if I actually I'm a cranial surgeon, so I'm actually studying a lot of cognitive functions for neuro-oncology surgery specifically. But the way you guys approach the topic is completely different to what I'm doing in my clinical practice. So I was actually really fascinated by it. So the first question is possibly the most obvious one, which is, let's define intelligent if that is possible. Like, how do we actually define it? And what is the debate about the definitions of intelligence?
I think, as you can imagine, Giulio, that there's no one definition that every single psychologist in the world is going to agree with. That there's nothing in the social sciences where everyone agrees unanimously on definition. But a very popular definition, and one that I subscribe to in the book, is that intelligence is a global ability to solve problems, engage in cognitive effort, and learn and figure out how to handle one's environment. And because it's a global ability, it's an ability that's used in every cognitive task that anyone's ever developed. And so we like to define it as this general reasoning capacity to solve problems.
So here's where it becomes a bit more complicated, because now we have this concept, which I understand is called generalized intelligence. And I got a very technical question of it. I mean, forgive me if I am giving you wrong definitions on that, because I as I said, I'm not an expert on the topic at all. But my understanding of general intelligence is like this. So we have different skills as human beings, and even the animals. Like I was fascinated to learn that even in animals this has been tested. So we got different skills, and someone who's actually likely to be proficient in one or two skills is likely to be proficient in other skills, and the intersection between these skills is what we call factor G, the generalized intelligence, essentially. $1,000,000 question is why this is true and the multiple intelligence theory is not. I actually read it on your book, but mostly for whoever is listening.
Yeah, I'll start with first what this G is. G is observed through a statistical procedure we call factor analysis, and it's the math behind it is too complex for the book or for a fun little chat on a Monday night pub in English. But factor analysis combines data and looks at where variables share their variance. In other words, it looks for the overlap among variables. And this thing we call G, this general intelligence, is where every cognitive task overlaps. And so we're able to look at that and say, wow, no matter what cognitive tasks we give people, whether it's short-term memory, whether it's a short-term learning test, whether it's a verbal memory, whether it's vocabulary knowledge, whether it's a spatial reasoning, whatever, all of these tasks have something in common, and that something is this ability we are using to solve them, no matter what their surface appearance is. And that's the G. It's what all these tasks have in common. And we know that, well, you said, why is there a G? That's one of the things we don't entirely know. That probably is tied up with humans' evolutionary history. It's probably tied up a lot with the biology and the neuroscience, which you would be more of an expert on than I do, the neuroscience piece. But this is why we know that Gardner's multiple intelligences theory is incorrect, because Gardner says all of these abilities are completely independent. They're all uncorrelated. Whether you're good at linguistic tasks has nothing to do with whether you're good at math tasks. And we have data going back over 110 years showing that all of these cognitive tasks are correlated. They do have something that they share overlapping, and that something's G. And so that's my short answer to a question that probably could be its own book.
Can I ask? Sorry, go, Marco.
Oh, just one point. Because especially in some literature, there's sometimes a lot of confusion between the statistical definition of general intelligence, which is this common factor between tasks. Some people have interpreted that as a mechanism. Mm-hmm. So basically, the general intelligence is some, whatever mechanism in the brain that does certain particular things. And I just want to point it out, and you, Russell, maybe you want to expand on that. But a lot of confusion. For example, I'm an evolutionary psychologist, and sometimes when people debate the evolution of general intelligence, so a lot of confusion comes from some people are talking about G, some people are talking about something else, which is this supposed general ability to, say, reason and draw analogies or whatever. And I think, this has to be cleared up before, because otherwise people are listening and thinking about two completely different things.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that, Marco. And I would say this doesn't mean that people are always using one cognitive strategy. It doesn't mean that they're always using one portion of their brain when they solve problems. We're just talking about how on the tests, and I come from the testing world, how people's scores on all these cognitive tasks correlate, and no one's ever been able to find a task that's definitely cognitive that's unrelated to all these other abilities. And it flies in the face of everything in Gardner's multiple intelligences theory claims, and it effectively falsifies Gardner's theory.
And can I just ask? Sorry, keep interrupting each other.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to very quickly ask, because I thought what was fascinating in Judah's introduction and what you just followed up with, how there are correlations between the sort of the way that the human intelligence works and the animal kingdom. So I'm just interested to find out, how do you apply these tests in animals, and how do you sort of find the same strain amongst the animal kingdom?
I personally have never done animal research, but I find it incredibly fascinating, and I think it's the key to understanding our early evolutionary history for not just intelligence, but for a lot of psychological traits. But it's not terribly different from what we do in humans. You find different tasks that some animals of a species can do better than other organisms. And you can, again, score these different tasks, put it in factor analysis. The research I've read indicates that if you do this with a series of tasks, in mammals, you usually or almost always get a general factor the way you do in humans. With Non-mammals, I'm much more skeptical that there is a general capacity to solve problems. But that being said, there hasn't been as much research done on non-mammals, and it's often just pigeons. The difficulty is comparing anything across species, because there are just simply certain tasks that biologically some species can't do. And the common sense example I use in the book is we can teach sign language to gorillas and chimpanzees because they have hands that can form the signs. You can't teach that to pigs. You can't do a color discrimination task to dogs because they can't see color. So you do have to customize tasks for the species biology and for the species range of responses. And that's what makes cross-species comparisons so difficult, is that you have to find a number of tasks that different species can do with approximate the same amount of ease. And that's hard.
Thank you. We already have a couple of questions from the audience, which I actually find very interesting. So the first one is, I think, Lorenzo, I'm going to leave this one for later on. I've already replied to this because I think it's more for what we're going to talk in the second section of the interview. But this one is interesting because what I found really fascinating is that in your book, you quoted a couple of studies where what is called the cytoarchitectonic of the brain in people with high intelligence and with people with low intelligence is different. And what I found absolutely gorgeous about it is that I actually went and read those papers, and I found that, well, I didn't know this. Essentially, like the neuron itself, I know. So intelligence is kind of, from a neurological point of view, from a neurophysiological point of view, is kind of defined by the synapses that we build on a very general level. I mean, this is a very gross definition. I appreciate that. But, let's say that our brain works better on the basis of the type of synapses that it builds. Okay. Now, the intelligent individuals tend to have very orderly synapses in a way. Like the architectonics of the synapses is beautiful, while the people with low cognitive abilities, they have kind of a disorderly synapse, like they're all over the place. And that is I found it fascinating. I was not aware of that. But to come to the question of our guest, Alessandro was asking, are there any hypotheses of what the physical cause of different level of intelligence is? Like, are there any studies on that behind the, on top of those that you put it on your books, that actually show that the brain of intelligent individual is different to the ones of non-intelligence or with lower cognitive performance?
Yes, there are biological differences, and I think that's what Alessandro's getting at when he asks about physical causes. The data we have, our strongest data is about just overall brain size. Smarter people have larger brains and heavier brains, and that's after controlling for body size and controlling for sex. But you're right, down at the cellular level, there are noticeable differences between the brains of smarter people and the brains of people of more average or below average intelligence. And so we do know that at least partially, the reason why some people are smarter than others is because of their biology. And Giulio, you talked about one of my favorite articles I cite in the book by my colleague Aaron Gensch. When it was published, I tweeted that this one article is more important than everything I'll ever do in my career, because it really does show very clearly that in the brain we have global differences in brain size, we have structural differences, we have connectivity differences, and cellular differences. And so I would say to Alessandro, partially one of the reasons some people are smarter than others is because of how their brains are biologically organized. That being said, that's not a full answer, because then the question becomes, well, why are some brains biologically organized in ways that make people solve problems on tests better? And the short answer is the answer with everything in social sciences: genes and environment. The long answer is we're still figuring that out.
Sorry, I saw that Marco was about to say something, so I'll just double check that you don't.
Well, so much to say. Well, one thing that's, again, interesting about the, say, brain correlates of intelligence and G. Well, I think I'm going to talk a bit later about the overlap with some psychopathology and mental disorders, but there are some. So when you look at the genetics of it, one thing, and I think the finding is still valid, but the idea, when you look at the genetic basis for intelligence, there's two things that stand out. One is that there seems to be a fairly large role for just damaging mutations, like rare mutations that probably what they do is impair synaptic development or connectivity or whatnot, or metabolic efficiency. There's a number of things. So mutations seem to play a fairly substantial role. But also when you look at the other factors, or more common factors, when you find genes that seem to affect intelligence, they seem to do it in a broad way, in a broad fashion. So it's not like because they affect some very specialized ability of the brain, but they seem to have effects that are kind of broad, like G does. So there's this idea of generalist genes for intelligence. And the reason why that's interesting is that if you look at stuff like personality, if you look at the genetic of personality, you also find, substantive genetic influence, but the genes don't work in that way. It's all over the place. So it's very, it's very mixed up, and you have, you don't get the same kind of generalized genetic signal that you get for intelligence, which I think, let's say it goes a bit beyond just finding that intelligence is heritable. It actually is heritable in a way that reinforces this idea that G is some kind of confluence of factors that somehow influences cognition in a very broad range.
Yes, I agree with that.
I had a quick question, and Julia will need to forgive me because I really can't help myself but think of science fiction when we talk about the stuff. I really love sort of the idea of where we might be able to take our brains in the future. And it kind of occurs to me, especially when we start talking about this, the synapses and how they can build together in order to make a sort of more efficient network within our brain, and the sort of neuroplasticity of the brain and all this kind of stuff. And I can't help but wonder, do you believe that we might ever be able to develop certain prosthesis or systems that we can add to our brain that will actually increase our IQ because they manage to interlock the synapses in a way that becomes more efficient for the brain? And sort of on the same side of this question, do you believe that this could, if we're thinking about society as a hierarchy, and I think if we think about society maybe as a competency hierarchy, do you think that could change the way that the structures are built in our own society if we start sort of rolling this out to more than, a small batch of people?
No, that's a great question, Maria, and I'm gonna use science fiction examples since that's up your alley. There's some science fiction scenarios that I think are much more plausible than others. The one I think is most plausible is using genetic information to make predictions about the future. In fact, we're already there. Anyone can pay some money to a commercial DNA test company like 23andMe or Ancestry.com with a little saliva swab. They can send in their DNA sample, and already with current knowledge and technology, it's already commercially available. We can make predictions for people's risk for heart disease, for diabetes, for Alzheimer's, for breast cancer, for colorectal cancer. That's a reality now. That same technology and that same theory can be used for intelligence or for predicting a child's likelihood of graduating from college. We're there. So to me, scientifically, that science fiction wise, that's most closely to Gattaca. Gattaca has the genetic engineering, but right now, if I wanted to, I could give a DNA test to all 4 of my children, and the oldest one's 6 years old, first grade, and predict right now which one's going to be most likely to graduate from college. Now, the predictions aren't very accurate right now, but that's pretty much a reality. And the predictions are only going to get more accurate. So Gattaca minus the genetic engineering is already here. What I find really implausible is Flowers for Algernon, where a young man who has an intellectual disability gets an experimental medical treatment, and it raises his IQ 30 or 40 points, and he's broken free from his disability, but over time, he loses it. It's a temporary effect. I don't think that's ever going to happen. The latest evidence about what these genes do is that their most important influence is prenatally, in laying down the foundation for a developing brain. And there are still genes that matter for intelligence after birth, but it seems like the majority of the influence happens long before someone's born. And so I'm skeptical that there will be a prosthesis or there will be a drug or a medical procedure that will give us what we see in Flowers for Algernon, where someone's IQ boosts 20 or 30 points.
Unless someone could influence the embryo, let's say. Yes,
it would have to be an embryo influence, and that's what I sort of imagine the genetic engineering in Gattaca is probably like. But as far as, oh no, there's a child born with an IQ of 70, can we do something to them now that will make them a genius? I don't think that's ever going to be possible. And then the last scenario you said about maybe restructuring society, to me, that's Brave New World right there. Where you have the alphas and the betas and the gammas. And in a way, society's already doing that. Socioeconomic status is itself genetically inherited. Education, partially. Education level also has a genetic influence. And society's actually doing a pretty good job, not perfectly by any means, but generally, Western societies have enough opportunities open to most of their citizens where people can rise or fall to match somewhat their genetic potential. And so we're already sort of there, although it's not as intentional as what we see in Brave New World. But we have done a great job in Western societies over the past century in tearing down artificial social barriers. There's a lot more opportunities for women to have careers and have education. We've torn down barriers of discrimination for the most part. And so unfortunately, what's being replaced are genetic barriers. And those might be harder to tear down in the future. It's really easy to pass a law banning nepotism in government positions. It's a lot harder to pass a law that says we can't let people with high genetic potential have better jobs.
It's what I call the curse of the Swedish sociologist. Podcast, but so my Neuralink. I think
Neuralink, for example.
That is exactly what she's talking about.
Right. So one thing, I think one way to understand the why some scenarios might be more likely than others, I was thinking, how would I kind of explain the way that's intuitive? So part of the fact is that we actually now, again, the prediction is not great. Depends what it's amazing compared to say 20 years ago, but still not great. But I think we are now at the point where we know some of the genes that are involved in, say, higher versus lower intelligence.
Yes.
So we know that, which they are. We don't know exactly what they do. We have a vague idea that, for example, they're involved in, say, synaptic development, when in development, maybe they activate or not. But we're very, very far away from a detailed understanding of not just what the genes do, in detail, but also how whatever they do feeds into intelligence. Because there's, the modeling that's linking, say, synaptic structure to actual reasoning, it's incredibly primitive. And I don't mean to be, it's actually pretty, fascinating, but it's not like we know, if we change this gene, we know exactly why it impacts intelligence, what it does, and why, no, we don't know that. So we are at the stage where we can cook. So we know the ingredients that go into the cake, right? But we don't know exactly why, which means, let's say, go back a couple of 100 years, people know if you put yeast into a cake, it will become more fluffy, fluffier. But they don't know why exactly that happens. There may be something related to, similar to beer, so maybe it's bubbles, this kind of understanding.
Yeah, and we are very much in the infancy in understanding this. And something I say in the book, in the Know, I say that the genes aren't the ones solving the problems on an intelligence test. The gene can't see, it can't think, it can't whisper the answer in your ear. Whatever the gene is doing, it's copying some RNA, which then, does something in a cell. There's a long chain of causality from here's some genetic variants to here's someone who can solve a lot of problems. And we are not close to doing that.
Yeah, and the metaphor would be thinking of, say, doing something right now, doing something to people's brain that will raise intelligence. Is like, going into a cake and finding a way to make it fluffier by going into the cake and like inflating the bubbles of air or something like that. We don't know, but we know that, for example, if you put more yeast, it will be fluffier. So that's why short term and bearing some unpredictable development in neuroscience, the genetics seem the path of the least resistance, because we are really at that stage. We know some of the ingredients that go into the cake, and we know a little bit about what happens if you put more or less of a certain ingredient, but we haven't figured out why. That you can already cook. That's the thing. You can already cook and bake decent cakes in this way. Of course, when you figure out the chemistry and the mechanics and everything, well, now you can, say, do industrial food production. That would be your...
That's Brave New World, is the industrial production.
We're far from there. And ideas of like plugging something in the brain that will just, raise your IQ right now is like, I don't think we're barely figuring out the details of, say, layers of perception and motor control, the understanding of what in the brain exactly, how it does sophisticated reasoning. It's just not there. So,
yeah, I would agree.
Hard to predict.
I'm gonna chip in on this because while you guys were talking, I actually was thinking about something interesting. I'm not really sure if I'm just speculating or. So one of the things that I would say is that, again, this comes mostly from my clinical practice more than real data. So I'm not quoting data here, but one of the things that I would say is that, so my main field of research and practice is brain tumors, okay? And one of the things that I would say is that we have to, this is data, actually, this part. People with a very low IQ, they normally do have, well, there is at least a substantial portion of them. I wouldn't say it's a majority, and I wouldn't say, but it's definitely not a small minority. They actually have an organic problem. And when Russell was saying society is actually doing a pretty good job, I would say we're doing a pretty good job in that respect, in the sense that when there is an organic problem, we're treating it. I'll give a couple of examples. A kid with intractable seizure is a kid that is going to develop a cognitive impairment. We know that. And so if we solve the seizures, which now thanks God we normally do, we sort out actually also the cognitive problem, at least partially. It might not be, the next Nobel Prize, but is going to have a normal IQ. And same for example, cerebellar tumors. And one of the things that I was thinking about is that maybe we're not going to be in a situation where we're going to be able to increase intelligence per se. But if we actually manage to work on the single skills that then define intelligence, one of the examples I have is that kids with cerebellar tumors, they become unable to move around, and that impacts on the movement learning. And then if the learning is impaired, the cognition is impaired. We know that because these kids have low IQ because they cannot move during the infancy. So I was thinking maybe, again, speculating here, maybe one way to move forward from this point of view is actually to act on those, like breaking down the single skills and work on those to actually try to raise the IQ of someone who has a low IQ. And from that point of view, I'm coming to the question is how much, the key question that we have, and how much environment actually impact on the cognitive performance, because that's possibly the question that I think all social scientists want to know, and potentially politicians also, because obviously that has massive implications on social policies, I would think.
Yes, and environment is a lot easier to change right now with current technology than genes. And so, again, to use a phrase from earlier in the broadcast, path of least resistance. So if you want to change intelligence, why not start with the thing that's easiest to change, which is environment? And environment is incredibly important. I don't care what your genes are and how many alleles you got that predict you're going to be smarter. If I lock you in a box for the first 15 years of your life, you're not going to have a high IQ. I don't care what your genetic potential was. And those of you who are listening who know anything about behavioral genetics, you know that this is not a profound insight. But I feel like it's important to remind people that we always have to have the environmental conditions that permit flourishing for any trait, whether it's high athletic ability, high IQ, personality traits, etc. So I do think it's important to give everyone as favorable of an environment as possible. But within the range of what is typical in Western countries, we find that genetic differences tend to matter more than environmental differences. And that's especially true in adults. In childhood and early childhood, environment does seem to matter more for IQ. But as people age, the genetic variation becomes more than the environmental variation. And so that tells us that genetics is more important within the range of environments we normally see. As far as strategies and interventions to teach specific skills, the word I would apply to that research is disappointing. We can raise specific skills. We know how to do that. If you want to raise someone's vocabulary, teach them more words, reward them for memorizing new words and definitions, have them read more, expose them to more words. Okay, we can do that. But that has very little impact on someone's IQ or someone's G. And so the general thought is that you would have to train a whole lot of abilities for a very intense period of time. And that to me sounds like school. So, I mean, send people to school, then yes, we probably can raise IQ. The problem is in Western countries, almost every child already goes to school. And so, yeah, raising IQ beyond what we see in typical Western environments is very difficult.
I think maybe it's my role today, I think, help clarifying and maybe raise some points. There's a couple of things here, and I think it's one way to connect, which it's in there, what Russell was saying, just trying to make it more explicit, is that it's one thing what the environment can do in specific cases when let's say having a tumor growing in parts of the brain or not being able to move around at all. Then of course it can matter massively.
Mm-hmm.
The thing is, however, statistically over a population, if those circumstances are rare enough, it won't really matter on a statistical level. So that's the difference. The environment can be 99% of the problem in some specific cases, and yet matter very little at the level of a population. So that's and it's not completely intuitive for a lot of people. The other thing,
yes, I appreciate that clarification. Yes,
right. So you can find all sorts of cases in which or genetics. Sometimes the environmental on some things, the environmental component is actually much stronger, but you can find cases in which people would say a very let's say impactful genetic condition, right? That's what in their specific case really matters. So what you see when people talk about how much intelligence is affected by genes versus environment in general, what you're doing is averaging over a population. So of course, if there's some, the rare cases will kind of smooth out, and the big sinner will be what happens in, let's say normal conditions for most people in, with common, genetic background and so forth. The other thing is maybe, I don't know, this is a bit technical, but I found it really helps in discussions, at least for Russell, but maybe a good point to explain the G versus non-G thing, because again, so raising IQ, because IQ you're testing, you give usually like a battery of tests, and you try to estimate this general factor. So IQ is kind of you can think of it as an estimate of G. However, that's not G. It's G estimated through performance on a bunch of tasks. And so stuff that is not G, specific abilities, specific knowledge, and specific skills will actually also contribute to IQ. And one thing that happens is that a lot of, let's say, interventions and environmental effects do raise IQ. And when you do the statistics, go deeper in the statistics of it, they raise IQ not because they raise G, but because they raise the specific abilities. And that can make a difference, in terms of what you think the interventions are doing. And I'll just...
Yeah, and so just to answer your question, or to clarify and explain what you're asking, Marco. Yeah, when we get an IQ score for one particular individual, it's mostly G, but it's also some non-G things. It's their linguistic ability to comprehend the directions. It's their visual, spatial reasoning to understand the visual stimuli and to pay attention to important details. Their mathematical reasoning ability might matter. Auditory processing might matter for verbally administered tests and instructions. When we get G, you have to observe G through factor analysis, and factor analysis can't be done on just one person's data. You need a large sample. And so when we get one particular person's IQ score in a clinical setting, for example, we are measuring G, but we're also measuring that other stuff, those non-G abilities. And so when we find very often in these studies in people who don't have environmental deprivations and people who don't have genetic rare mutations that cause problems, they don't have tumors, etc. We find that, yes, we can raise IQ, but it's raising those non-G abilities, and that G is not really altered much by these interventions, at least on the global, the population scale. And that is an important thing. We can raise the metric of G, of IQ, but we're not necessarily raising the global ability that helps people answer, solve cognitive problems and all sorts of things. And the analogy I give to my students is that your mass is a physical component of your body. It's a physical characteristic of your body. Step on the scale and you get a number, which is your weight. And your weight number and your mass aren't the same thing. Well, IQ is the weight number. I can raise that weight number by putting on a backpack full of books and then stepping on. Or I can lower it by making sure I'm not wearing my shoes, that I take off my belt, and the number's down. The number, the IQ, can change without my body's mass changing. Just like we can train specific things without changing G.
Right. And sometimes that doesn't matter, right?
Oh yeah, sometimes it doesn't matter at all. Yeah,
it doesn't matter. Sometimes it does, especially, one way I think does matter is that the specific skills don't generalize very well.
Very, yeah.
The other thing. So if you can train people. So for example, in say visual spatial tasks, you can and it works at least for a while, right? Mm-hmm. People will actually get better at pretty much anything that you train them on.
Oh yeah.
But the thing that doesn't happen is this global effect of becoming better, say in visual spatial skill. As a result, now you become smarter across the board. That, as far as I understand, doesn't quite happen. It's really, really hard to find generalization effect. The thing about G, whatever that is, and it might be more about brain efficiency or brain processing speed or whatnot, is that it's ubiquitous. It really affects everything you do. And so when you're looking for this kind of training people or finding some interventions that will raise their general ability to deal with any kind of task, that's the hard part.
Yeah.
Because that's what G does, and it's really hard to raise G through interventions. While if you want to train specific abilities, you can do that, but you usually train in a specific way and they don't quite generalize to other skills and abilities. So there's a bit of a dilemma. And sometimes it doesn't matter, because what you're trying to do is exactly that.
Yeah.
No, so I'm a little bit concerned about this because I was always taught, probably by my overzealous parents, read more and you'll be a lot smarter when you're older. So I'm a little bit concerned about this. And the second reason why I'm concerned about this is because so I will have to have a word with them after this. But the other reason I'm a little bit concerned is because it kind of sounds to me like what people are really afraid of, or at least what people that I have spoken to are kind of afraid of, especially when it comes to having a career and trying to progress in that career, is some people believe that at some point you reach a ceiling, right? And you just can't get past that ceiling. And that's sort of, the rest of your life for you. And I've always kind of fought a little bit against that, because I always thought, no, you can learn more things and you need to stay curious throughout your life, and you can improve and all that kind of stuff. And I'm starting to get the impression that actually you might really truthfully hit that ceiling. So can we maybe just clarify?
Sorry, Marco, say it again.
Oh yeah, no, but I was congratulating Maria Paola for her beautiful growth mindset.
It sounds really fatalistic, Maria. I understand. I understand that impression. And I think of it in likening. I think of it in terms of training someone in music. This is something that people have believed. Oh, if you have a child learn an instrument, they'll be smarter. That's not turning out to be true in the best research. But there are still good reasons to learn a musical instrument. And other things we do for children. There are still good reasons to read to your child. There are still good reasons to encourage your child to do better at math, to learn more skills. A lot of the skills we are training in people are still valuable to have. And so I have to take my son to his piano lesson this afternoon. I don't give him piano lessons because I think it's going to raise his G. I give him piano lessons because it's good to learn an instrument. It opens up your mind to different ways of thinking. It creates skills. It brings the arts into your life. you can do these trainings and they can be very good without raising G. And so, yes, read to your kids, have books in the house, maybe be a little skeptical that it will raise your child's IQ a lot. But some of my children, not all, really like it when I read to them. It's part of the bonding. They some of them enjoy the words. They like looking at the pictures. There's good reasons to do these things. They don't have to raise G or raise IQ to be good. And I think that encouraging a wide variety of skills, talents, knowledge is good in children, if for no other reason to just have doors open to them that they can choose later to walk through or not. As for adults, I don't see anything wrong with continuing to improve your work skills and to improve your knowledge and training. It can be very good for your career. It can help you get ahead without raising your G. There's a lot of good things we can do for people. They don't have to raise G or IQ to provide benefits.
Let me add some perspective to that. So two thoughts. One is, if you think about like competitive sports, I think everyone's way more at ease with the idea of people having some kind of ceiling. It's like, let's say you're really good at even a good jumper, and you're jumping high, but you're not, say, a world champion. I don't think people believe that if you just train more, at some point you will break, the world record. I mean, for some people that might be true, but you have to be in that zone. So for sports, people are just okay with that. I mean, I can throw a certain distance, I can run a certain speed. I mean, I'm never going to be, a world champion of sprinting, and that's fine. With intellectual ability is a bit, but one thing that maybe is a bit different, and I think, so this is a way of thinking about intelligence that used to be popular. It's not that popular anymore, but let me try. And the idea is that part of what IQ does for you is changing the speed with which you acquire skills and information. To some extent, not completely, but to some extent, is a bit of how steep the learning curve is. So people are smarter in general; they just learn faster, and so if you have, say, a work, let's say you're a mathematician, you have to learn more complex, topics, and you have to build incrementally. So you need to understand this before you understand this, and then you can use to understand that. Now, the speed is going to allow you to progress through this chain of abstraction and complexity much faster. And if you're, say, less smart than, say, a monster IQ, world-class mathematician, I mean, can you still understand that stuff? I mean, you could. It may be just going to take you a long, long time. So you just spend just more time and more effort. And at some point, for most people, what they find is that there's diminishing returns. So it's not like they can't learn more advanced stuff. It's just each bit of knowledge and skill is costing more and more time and effort. So most people at some point are like, okay, this is where I'm stopping. And I think this is a slightly more productive way of thinking, because it's true that you can make progress. But if you're thinking of your, say, general intelligence as something that modulates the speed at which you progress, I think it helps to understand what's going on too. It's not like there's a hard ceiling in terms of, okay, this thing just doesn't fit in your brain. Give up. It's like, maybe you can get there, but it's just going to take longer. And maybe you're going to be slower at doing that. And again, the thing is, if something takes long enough, you might as well not try in many circumstances. And so most people at some point find their kind of optimal level of effort. Some people just don't give up. They just, okay, I really care about that skill. I'm just going to put in the extra effort. And so there's some wiggle room for people depending on motivation and, persistency and this and that, for sure. So I would frame it in terms of not thinking of a hard ceiling where just, bang on this is like, and you can't make progress. It's more that if you think that the speed for acquiring higher and higher level of skill becomes, it becomes lower, and at a pace that might be actually, be a bit exponential. So, it's not just a bit slower, but substantially slower after a point. I mean, it starts to look a bit like a wall in front of you. I don't know if it's more optimistic or not, but I think it's a useful way of thinking about it. Yeah.
I got a political question now, which is no, a relatively mild one, which is this. So first of all, my takeaway from all the great information that you guys have given us is that at the end of the day, intelligence is probably overrated. If you essentially, well, in a sense that if you have someone who actually, someone can perform very well in what he does, and not to be Sheldon Cooper or Albert Einstein or whatever example we want to quote, which is great news for all of us, essentially, especially me, I would say, especially in this session today. But the real question I have is that, this is a kind of a refrain everywhere. I've noticed that this is true in politics in Italy, it's true in politics in the US these days, and pretty much all over the world, in UK, Australia, New Zealand, like in the Western countries in general. Like there is a portion of politicians which I tend to agree with, going, oh, education, that's the key to actually have successful citizens, informed citizen, a better democracy, blah, blah, blah. Now, I tend to agree with that, with a couple of caveats, so first of all, coming back to what Russell was saying, we have school. Sure, school is doing a pretty damn good job right now, but I feel it can definitely do better in many respects. So that's the first caveat. The second caveat is, in a way, it's true, but we also live in the area where we have the most educated generations ever. Mm-hmm. So I am not sure realistically. So it sounds like the opposite of what I just said, but this is exactly. I'm playing devil's advocate here. Realistically, we probably achieve as much as we could achieve. Well, we are not going to achieve much more in that respect, especially for public funding and stuff like that. And the third question I notice is that I'm not sure this is true, and this is actually the question I want to put to you, to Russell and to Marco, is what I notice is that when people become very specific in their field, they tend to lose the bigger picture. Mm-hmm. And I can tell you this is particularly true for neurosurgeons, but I suspect it's true for many other professionals.
For lawyers as well.
Yeah, exactly. So, and this is I would say that from a political perspective, if you want to have functioning citizens, this is actually kind of a handicap, in a sense that you are very good and you're very rational on what you do, but you tend not to apply the same kind of analysis to everything else. And so the question is whether we can, I wouldn't say that we need more education. We probably need to work on the quality of education to actually try to make people function better in multiple domains. Mm-hmm. That's the idea that I got, but I'm not sure whether you agree or not.
I think there would be benefits to having people maybe specialize a little bit less. And you're right, when people become experts in the field, they're trained to think in terms of their specialty. Hence why lawyers think of everything in terms of, legal terms and rules of evidence and due process. Educators think that everything can be fixed by finding the right class and teaching the right skill. And so I do think that some intellectual humility is in order. And one thing I discuss in the final chapter of the book is that high IQ people have a tendency to only associate with people who are about as smart as they are. They live in neighborhoods full of very educated people. Their friends are people they meet in their workplace, which is full of people like them. And they marry people that they met in college or at work or in their social circles. And so high IQ people very much lose sight of what it's like outside of their bubble. I think we all do that in our disciplines. I think a lot of us do that in our social circles. And some intellectual humility and some understanding that no, high intelligence does not make you qualified to solve every problem in the world. And it does not give you an insight into everything, including a pandemic. not automatically, at least. I think some intellectual humility of understanding that there might be important abilities, important knowledge, important training outside your field that can be very relevant. Because when you spend too much time in just one field, you spend too much time in only one social circle, you very much do lose an understanding of what it's like for people in the rest of the world. And so I make it, and that's one of the great things about studying intelligence, is that it relates to so many things. I end up being forced to read an article about neuroscience, another one about genetics, and another one about ethics, and another one about education. And but I do think some intellectual humility and some reduction in specialization would go a long ways in helping people. And from a political and social standpoint, I think more emphasis on intellectual humility in our education would help people maybe have a little bit less resentment and rancor towards people who don't agree with them politically or socially.
Yeah, it's full of trade-offs.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think, you know, we should open. I don't think it's probably the right context, but, you know, it's going to become a long discussion to think about it, because education is more than, well, one thing is more than intellect.
Mm-hmm.
And so one thing,
and we're really good at teaching facts to children, and we're really good at teaching the core skills of reading, algebra, basic scientific facts. We're a lot harder. We're not as good at teaching people to consider multiple points of view. We're not as good at teaching people to fight against confirmation bias and to question their own assumptions and worldview. That's a lot harder, and I don't know. Yeah,
and there's probably relevant today, but one thing you have to also consider a bit is that, well, I mean, it goes in a different direction, but when you have an education system, it will pass on, you know, useful knowledge and useful skills and all sorts of good things. It will also pass on certain points of view, and diversifying is often a good idea, in the sense that if everyone's educated in exactly the same way to kind of come in contact with the same exact ideas, well, you don't have protection against, let's call them infectious bad ideas, right? And so education systems can actually, you know, they're the vector for all sorts of good things, but they're also vectors for, you know, incredibly bad ideas that can spread. And historically, you have this balance between, you know, sometimes, let's call it intellectual elites, which usually do, you know, good service to the population, but sometimes they just get some really stupid, crazy ideas with horrible consequences. And the fact that not everyone is, you know, inducted in the same bubble of thinking can actually provide some balance to the system. So I don't know how that plays out exactly, but it's it was just an example of the stuff that is not really about performance or knowledge or learning, but that goes into how you manage an education system. And I think one of the things that right now, especially in the US, I think it's people lose track of is that diversifying can actually protect you from, the entire intellectual elite just going in the same direction blindly because there's no counterpoint. Right. So, anyways, and you want to find it doesn't mean you have to just educate 20% of the population and keep the others as a social break on stupid ideas. This is not what I'm saying, but it's one of the things when you start talking about, say, let's say, get everyone to college. Well, there's some challenges to that. One is that, you know, you can't keep doing the same things if you're increasing the proportion of the population you're getting into college. What you do in college is going to change, and people are just deluded if they think that it won't, and in practice it does. So you want to, you know, that's like one trade-off, but also in the realm of not just the skills and the knowledge, but the kind of viewpoints and ideologies and whatnot that filters through the education system. It's very dangerous, I think, to just you see what I mean? Lose the counterpoint. And that part of intellectual humility, as Russell was mentioning, like being aware that sometimes very smart people in sync, they get some really bad ideas. Being aware of that would be a wonderful thing, but it's not something that's very much in evidence right now.
Can I put a question to you both then on this topic? And actually, I think it's a dual question. So, from the point of view of this, broadening your spectrum in a sense. I read something about Elon Musk starting a school where he puts a lot of emphasis on, obviously, not only the sort of robotics, technology, coding, and all that lovely stuff that we should expect in the future, but also teaching logistics, like teaching logical thinking. So my question was, do you think that maybe for the way that I find a lot of countries are really split in half nowadays? I mean, as an example, if you take the US, I personally think that actually one of the things that probably came out of the election is how much the US is actually split, almost 50-50. And I think one of the causes of that could also be the fact that it's difficult for each side to sort of understand where the other side comes from, right? So one of the questions is, do you think that maybe teaching logical thinking in school could help this, where you're presented with a set of facts, but then you actually need to think about those facts? Because what happened to me a lot in school, for example, was a lot of memorizing of facts as opposed to taking the facts and then sort of putting them into action. And then the second question is, I read somewhere that 10%, and I can't remember if it's 10% of the world population or 10% of the US, so apologies for this, but 10% of either one of the two had an IQ that was below 80. So basically an IQ that meant that they were technically useless to society. So I have a question in relation to sort of the social policies in relation to that. What can one do in order to avoid having such a big proportion of a population that is sort of, in the real sense as was defined, useless to society?
Oh, Russell, we can hear you.
You're on mute.
Sorry, I
That was on purpose.
I muted. Yeah, it was on purpose. I muted because I had to cough and forgot that I'd unmuted. I do tackle a little bit about of this at the end of the book. I do talk about social implications and implications for society, and that's 10% within the U.S. and we're defining, and because we norm IQs within each country, whatever intellectual ability is 100 in the U.S., 10% is going to be below 80 among Americans, and then whatever is average intellectual ability in Italy, 10% of Italy is going to be below Italy's 80, and so it's just a statistical definition. But the United States military is banned by Congress from even taking recruits from that bottom 10%. I mean, and they've gone around that a few times. I talk about one of the most prominent examples. But every time they go around it, they find that, these generally men, but in modern times, to a lesser extent, women below an IQ of 80 are a lot harder to train. They are not good soldiers. They accidentally shoot themselves more often, things like that. And in an industrialized society where routine jobs are getting computerized, roboticized, it may get harder and harder to employ those people. Now, the economists look at this and say, people worried about the blacksmiths all going out of business 100 years ago and being unemployed, but those people just went to work in the factories building cars. There's no guarantee that the jobs that are replacing low-skill jobs today are going to also be low-skill jobs. And so if the new jobs, if there are not new niches for people with low skills, low IQ, then a lot of countries may very well discover an underclass, an intellectual underclass that they've never had to deal with before. 100 years ago, if you had an IQ of 75, you could put food on the table with a lot of energy and work ethic and a simple job. That's getting harder today. And I don't have all the answers, but if politicians would actually just talk about it, I think that would even just talking about it would be refreshing, because that bottom 10, 15, 25% of society, they don't have lobbyists trying to raise their issues. There's not an advocacy organization. And they are our fellow citizens. And just having someone talk about their needs and their challenges in a public forum would be nice. I don't know what the answer is, but let's at least talk about it and try to figure out as a society how to do these, how to deal with these challenges.
I gotta follow up on this, which is, I read this book that you probably heard of, because I mean it's not very popular here. Sorry, well, actually in the UK it is, but in Italy, for example, it's not very popular, but it's massive in the US, by Malcolm Gladwell, called Outliers. I'm not sure if you read about it. Mm-hmm. I find it extremely fascinating. Again, I don't know much about the author, so I don't know how much ground there is there. But one of the things that the author is stressing in the book, which makes sense, at least from an intuition point of view, is that people with great talent, they also have great opportunities. And that is the key factor, and is also a big aspect of the political debate nowadays. So inequality starts literally from childhood. Like if I grow up in a neighborhood that is wealthy, I just the fact that I know people who actually have a high intelligence, they have a high G, like let's say, and they know where to go to school, they do the good choices in life, it's helpful. The fact that I don't grow up there, like, let alone the problem of money, that like the economic, financial problem that these people have, the fact that I'm not born there, I haven't got an opportunity, I haven't got a family that is educated, is a massive, massive problem. And so the question is actually more data driven now, like and it's it requires a quick answer, I would say, probably, I hope at least, like how much that is true, because we talk about evidence with Marco on a previous episode of the podcast, like how much this is true from the data that you guys have, like poverty, is the impact of poverty the impact of bad circumstances, does it impact so massively in the development of IQ or not?
Definitely. And it depends on what sort of outcomes you're talking about. And I actually read an article just yesterday about this topic. When you're talking about overall average outcomes in life, you would rather be born smart into a poor family than be born stupid into a rich family. The child's genetic propensity for high intelligence or their IQ, the IQ itself, is a very good predictor about whether someone will rise or fall in socioeconomic status compared to their parents. Children who are smarter than their parents tend to, on average, end up with more prestigious jobs, high socioeconomic status. They tend to marry others who are similar to them. And then the reverse is true. And so I would say, in a general level, with general life outcomes like socioeconomic status, yes, there are advantages with socioeconomic status. There are advantages with family connections. We see this most clearly in politics. I find it absolutely silly to believe that George W. Bush wouldn't have become president if he hadn't been the child of a president. And in our country, children of senators and representatives and governors tend to be more likely to be elected themselves. And surely the lessons you learn around the dinner table, the political connections, the donor network has to help. And to think that that doesn't extend to other aspects in life, you're kidding yourself. And it's the same in Hollywood. Do you really think that Will Smith's children would be in major movies if they weren't Will Smith's children at that age? Probably not. So I think there is some of that, especially in fields like politics and entertainment, where connections and who you know do matter a lot. As far as an outlier, Malcolm Gladwell's Outliers, I would definitely agree that luck does matter. And we can point to situations where someone became very elite in their field and they just happened to get the most lucky environment possible. My wife is a former drama teacher, and one of the examples that from that field I've learned about is that one of the most important writers of musical theater in my country, his name's Stephen Sondheim, he was childhood friends with the son of another important writer of musicals, Oscar Hammerstein. When your best friend's dad is doing something like this, you already have an in. He had an in at age 14 in Broadway, whereas other people might be working for a decade or more to have the connections that he got as a kid. And so that matters. That being said, to boil everything down to environmental luck is just not true. Because I don't care who your parents are, or who your friends' parents are. If you don't have the propensity to make important contributions, all the connections in the world aren't going to help you out. So I think both matter, and I think the more eminent someone becomes, the more lucky they need to be. Genetic luck, the luck of an election, the luck of being born in a place where they could get a college education. I think being eminent requires a lot of luck, but some of that luck is genetic luck and IQ luck, especially in intellectual fields.
I mean, it's one thing, that's kind of ironic, but one of the remedies for, people with potential born in unlucky circumstances was exactly standardized testing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the whole point for developing IQ tests and giving children IQ tests was exactly to do that, mm-hmm. to find out who is has more potential and to get people out of bad environmental situations, give them opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
Which is something people kind of forget often. One thing I just want to say, there was a question popping up at some point in the video, and there was, is it true that poverty decreases IQ by 15 points? So let me give you my, I have a I think maybe I know what studies these are. There were the Indian studies about the seasonal thing. I don't remember the details, but it's my general advice is whenever you hear something like that, be skeptical. Because most of the times it turns out that, there's some controls that haven't been done. And if you include, for example, the genetics and other, feedback loops and things, it decreases a bit. And I just want to tell people, there's going to be a lot of that around. There's factoids about this or that. Or the other thing is, for example, whatever breastfeeding increases IQ, I think it was 12 points. It's always it's kind of funny because it's always in the 10 to 15 range, right? And when you look closer, it tends to evaporate a little bit. Unless you're talking about, and people have to realize that 15, when you hear this thing like, oh, breastfeeding increased IQ by 12 points, it's like, do you know how much IQ is?
A lot.
A lot of IQ. If we had anything that raises IQ reliably by 12 points, we'll be doing that maybe just mandatory.
Yeah. and as far as how much does poverty lower IQ, how much would growing up in a middle class or upper class home raise IQ. The question is compared to what?
Right.
The best study on this I've seen comes from Sweden. In one of these Scandinavian countries with a huge population register. They have IQ data for almost every male because of the military conscription, etc. And it's linked with medical and social and birth data, etc. They compared brothers, one of whom was adopted, and then another biological brother was raised by the biological parents. And the IQ difference was about a 4 to 5 point advantage for the adopted child. And so, okay, how much does being adopted into a middle or upper class Swedish home raise your IQ? 4 or 5 points compared to what you would have been born into in Sweden. Now, it's not as popular today, but in the United States, there used to be more international adoptions of babies from overseas. And I have a friend who adopted a girl from a Chinese orphanage. Chinese orphanage conditions aren't very good. And in China, there is a definite preference against adopting girls. So her chances of being adopted by a Chinese couple in China were probably very remote. She's adopted by a middle-class American family. We'll never know for sure, but I would be shocked if the IQ boost compared to being somewhat neglected in an orphanage wouldn't be 10 points or more. So I'm willing to say, okay, compared to a really negative environment, there could be a huge boost from growing up in a middle or upper class home. You have to ask yourself, compared to what? And if I could wave a magic wand and eliminate all poverty in Western countries, I don't think we'll see IQ increase 15 points. That's all I got.
Is that because of the baseline? So you're basically saying, if I understand it correctly, so depending on how big the gap is between the baseline and whatever you go into, the higher that gap is, the more you have a potential to raise your IQ, right?
I would say so, yes. And for the vast majority of children growing up in Western countries, that baseline is high enough that I'm skeptical that you could have an increase of more than 8 points, maybe, give or take. But I think the baseline compared to sub-Saharan Africa or a Chinese orphanage is much lower, and so there's much more room for improvement.
That makes sense. And I would say from a political standpoint, it's also an argument to say like that things are not so bad as they're often portrayed by, like, I would say most of the political parties, really, without picking up the side.
Well, you can't win an election if you can't point to a problem that you can solve.
Yeah, that's true. That's correct. Well, it's correct. Well, we're gonna go into a rabbit hole here, but I would say yes. It's just that not being divisive is out of fashion. That's the main problem that I see in modern politics, to be honest. Like it's
also not as sexy to tell people that the world is improving.
Yeah. Exactly. I have a final technical question, and then there's another. I think we're going to jump to another topic altogether. Well, obviously related, which is, I mean, a really short answer. I really don't want to dig in too much because this one is too much. Because I think I don't want to annoy who's listening to us. But from what I take from what you guys have told us, IQ is an extremely reliable way to measure G. And that is something that, I would like to not make it clear, but having you making it clear, because there is a lot of I would say hoax and speculation and debate about this in the mainstream media. Sorry for using these words. Well, that some people say, oh no, it's perfect, it's the best that we have. Some other people saying, some others saying is actually completely not reliable at all. My understanding is that it's actually very reliable. It's a very good tool. And I was wondering whether A, you think it's true, B, whether you think there are other tests and other tools that you guys actually use to measure intelligence.
Well, I mean, I have 4 chapters in the book about measuring intelligence. I'll just sum up the messages about what a century of research says. And the research is overwhelming that it's not hard to measure intelligence. In fact, it's one of the easiest things to measure in psychology. The content that we put on tests tends to be very good tasks to draw out people's intelligence and get them to use their global problem-solving ability. The tests are good enough to be trusted and used in decision-making, and they aren't biased against people who speak the language they're administered in as a native. That's an important caveat. And you know, all of us here are bilingual. Is extremely important to give people a test in their native language. I consider unethical not to do so. And so as long as you're doing that, then yeah, we can trust these tests a lot. And if you want details, like I said, 4 chapters, chapters 7 through 10.
Well, one thing as all tests, right, they measure. So I guess Russell is talking about, let's say, full scale, so kind of reasonably sized tests. So not like a 3-question you find on the internet. I mean, like, it's a reasonably sized test. You know, all psychometric tests, they measure best within a certain range. And you lose discrimination, the ability to differentiate when you go to the very high and very low scores. So for example, I guess if your IQ is 150 or 160 or 170, most tests will not really tell you that. So so when this is especially important to know when people are bragging about their IQ on Twitter. when they say I have an IQ of 180, you should ask, okay, what test did you take? Because
yes,
most don't actually get that high. So it's like,
Yeah, and you do have to make sure. Now, for the vast majority of people, the commercially developed tests are good enough. There are, you're right, a small number of people who may need harder tests, and there's different tests available. It's hard to get norms, but actually there's been some breakthroughs about that. But it gets really technical. But yes, most tests are designed to identify IQs in that middle, about 98% of the population. People at the extremes might need to take some tests that aren't as common. But still, if a child maxes out on a test or bottoms out on a regular test, then it's very common for school psychologists or teachers to then look for a test that can accommodate their needs. And these, as long as the tests are professionally developed, so I'm glad you mentioned that. They are very trustworthy, and we can use them to measure people's general intelligence. And the results are pretty good, pretty accurate, well, good enough to use for decision making.
Just one more question about this for me before we move on to the very fun topic of serial killers. So, do I understand it correctly then that because of genetics, you're basically born with, let's say, a type of ceiling that you can get to if your environment is correct, that can raise that genetic level for a couple of points? I mean, we said, between 5 to 10, 15 points, right? So is there no way that that genetic level can be raised apart from if we look at injecting a fetus or an embryo with some magic from the future?
In theory, there are genetic boundaries, and this is theoretical, that and we call it the reaction range, where we say, given typical environments, we expect someone's trait to be between this level, this level and this level, and that's not unique to intelligence. We have reaction ranges for height. I'm shorter than average. My wife's shorter than average. My children probably have a range of possible heights that they will be. And I will tell you right now, none of my children are going to be taller than average. And so all traits probably, in theory, have this reaction range of possible extent to which the trait can be developed. We do not know with current knowledge and technology what that is and what those boundaries for any particular person are. Yes, we can make a prediction for IQ. We can make a prediction for educational success, but it's just one prediction. And we don't really know what the person's maximum potential could be, given all the environment, all the luck, etc., that could help them out. And so, yeah, are there maximums and minimums? Yes, I will tell you right now, none of my children will be professional basketball players. You just don't get that with a dad that short and a mom that short. But I don't know whether, for example, my new baby girl, whether her maximum height is going to be, crud, I don't know the metric, 5 feet 7 inches, or whether it's 5 feet 4 inches. I don't know what her maximum is. And so my view is, with current knowledge and technology, you don't know what your ceiling is. Keep working if that's something you want. Now, what's possible in the future, I don't think any of us really truly know, but I already said what technologies I think are likely or not.
Mm-hmm. I mean, oh yeah. So who knows? I just say that I have to. I'm genetically programmed to say this every time. Especially for people think so. It's one thing to make prediction from your, say, DNA sequence. Mm-hmm. However, we can know that, but because it's individual, and the predictions are not for intelligence. They're not great at this point.
And for all traits, some people end up doing better, some people end up doing worse. That's just the nature of predictions.
When you make predictions based on the parents, on average that works, but the range, the possible range given to parents is wider than most people realize. Mm-hmm. Just something I say every time, because people, the correlation between parents and offspring on most traits, like some. I don't know for IQ, but it's probably some 0.10, 0.15, something like that. Yeah. Which means that there's really a huge range of possibility. And of course, if you look on average, so the average, so you have enough kids that it start to be a decent sample.
I don't have that many. I only have 4.
It's twice as well. It's pretty impressive right now. But so the average height of your kids, I think you can be quite confident. But the fact that one of your kids, for some kind of weird genetic combination, will actually become much taller than you would expect, that's much harder to predict. So from parents, the average is very easy to predict, but the range around that is just much wider than most people realize, including psychologists and geneticists sometimes. So that's something to keep.
And it's funny you mentioned the height of tallest and shortest children. I come from a family of 5 boys. I don't have any sisters. I'm the shortest. My tallest brother is 8 inches taller than me. I mean, that's a lot. Someone convert that to metric for me. I'm an American. I don't know the metric system. But that's a lot. There is a lot of range within families. And so, yeah, we can make a prediction. Some people will do better, some will do worse. We don't know what any one person's maximum is. Mm-hmm. And so I find it really hard to get fatalistic. I just say, well, why not work and try to do better? And it's not just with intelligence or education or income, but also medically. You have a risk for diabetes. Why not improve your diet and exercise more and lose some weight and try to beat the odds? What's the worst that can happen?
I think the best thing, because when you talk about intelligence and IQ and stuff, there's so many, the way people think is very constrained. And for this thing of hitting your maximum, it's like in this area, people just find so hard to think about it. And if you get into think about sports for a second, they're like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. So finding, like for diabetes, it's the same. I mean, if they tell you, do you have a risk for diabetes? What do? You say, okay, yeah, I'm just going to get diabetes.
Darn.
No. But that's what people kind of, when you talk about intelligence, they're like, oh, then if I have a prediction score for low IQ, then it means I should just give up. And well, so I think it really helps, Russell, so thanks for doing that, just finding areas that are different enough that people don't get kind of blinded by the hang-ups around IQ and intelligence. That's so useful.
There's a question from the audience that actually is perfect to introduce us to the last section of this very, very interesting chat, which is to tackle another pop culture fact. How does intelligence correlate with depression? And yes, I think Marco is going to chip in here because, one thing that we wanted to know, well, it's a broad question. We're going to break it down in many questions, which are essentially how do you see. Actually, let's start from the beginning. So, first of all, is it true that generalized intelligence in the population has improved over time? Second, are there any difference in intelligence in people with psychiatric disorders and people who are not, who are like haven't got a pathological condition, psychiatric pathological condition? Then from here onwards, we're gonna ask you a lot of other questions, because me and Maria Paula, we have this particular fixation on serial killers and so we're gonna open a very big Pandora box.
I have to say, I have recently been binging on all of the new serial killer documentaries that they have been showing on Netflix. So literally in the last week, I think I've watched like 3 or 4 of them.
Yeah, who hasn't? Like, yeah, exactly. So
right. I mean, that's a general law. People actually want to talk about serial killers.
Yeah. I don't blame them. One of my guilty pleasures is true crime shows. So Maria Paula, we're probably watching some of the same shows.
Fabulous. No, but you know what? Actually, it's funny because I was actually thinking over the weekend, because I did get a little bit concerned about why I was watching them, right? And I did think, I do believe that there is a part of human beings that watches them because we know exactly that if tipped over, we could do certain things. Genuinely, I mean, I do think that we walk around with this sort of battle between good and evil, and I do believe that a lot of people, if pushed, could kill someone else, right? So that's my personal belief, at least why I think a lot of people find it fascinating.
No, it's just you. No, yeah, we'll get there. I think, I think the first thing, though, the first part of the question was about changes in intelligence over time, and that I would defer to Russell.
Yes, definitely IQ has increased over time. This is one of the most solid facts about intelligence out there, that if you give a modern population an intelligence test, and if you travel back in time 100 years ago and you give that same test to the population, today's population will score higher, unquestionably. And if you give an old-timey test to a modern group today, the modern group will get a higher score. But this goes back to what we talked about earlier about how IQ is a mix of G and non-G influences. And it seems that increase is mostly non-G. I do have a study that I will somehow get around to. It's hard to do anything in a pandemic, where I want to look at whether, there's some aspects where some of that can be G related, but it seems to be that the increase is due to training a lot of those specific skills, teaching people to read, teaching them more science facts and more ways of thinking about the world in abstract terms, in terms of classification, for example. So IQ definitely has increased. Whether G has increased is a matter of debate. And I don't think there's strong evidence either way to say whether it's increased or whether it's stayed stable or whether it's even gone down. And so, are people smarter over time? If they are, it's not enough to create a new renaissance in the Western world. But definitely we are better at answering formal cognitive problems correctly. And so I don't know if we're better at global general reasoning, but we are better at solving analogies, for example.
Reaction times are, that's a trick. I didn't even know. I kind of lost track at some point, because one thing, one interesting fact when people talk about IQ, how general, let's say G, how general it is, and to counteract the idea that it's just about, say, complex problems. Actually, reaction times are G loaded. So people with high G, they're also faster at very simple tasks where you only to press like one key or the other depending on like simple cues. So one thing to get around this problem of whether what components of intelligence have increased is to look at reaction times. And there's been some work comparing, reaction times being recorded 150 years ago or something like that. And then, and I don't know where that stands right now, to be honest, but it was interesting.
There's some evidence that reaction times might have gotten a little slower in the past 150 years. But you're dependent on the surviving data, how good that sample was.
They say something. I suspect because we're not shooting each other anymore. Possibly that's the reason.
Yeah, that definitely helps.
Well, not having a war every 2 years. Seriously, yeah. Like maybe I don't know. I'm just speculating.
Definitely, and so but it's hard because for a lot of these long-term trend questions, we're dependent on whatever data happens to survive, and whether the data were collected, how good they were. It's often just luck if we can make these long-term comparisons. Another example of how G is not just measuring complex abstract reasoning, the complexity of children's drawings is G loaded. Given a certain age, given that all children are the same age when they do this, if you ask children to draw a person, kids who draw more details tend to have higher intelligence. Well, it's just pure luck that someone stumbled upon that there are surviving drawings from children with their ages that go back over 110 years. We're lucky that we have that. We're lucky that we have the 1870s, 1880s reaction time data. But none of these are extremely good measures of G. They measure it to an extent, but they're not as good as having a global battery of tasks. And we often have to do a lot of guessing and assuming before we can draw conclusions. And so the scores have definitely gone up. Has G gone up? Has the actual ability gone up? If it has, it's not enough to revolutionize the sciences and the arts in the 21st century compared to our parents' or grandparents' generation.
Okay, thank you. So, I suspect Alessandro's question going to the point of the correlation with psychiatric disorder. So let's start with depression, I would say, and then we'll move to our favorite topic. Apparently, all of us, like that concerns all of us now. We know we got this revelation. I suspect this is coming from the fact that there's a cliche. I'm not sure how true it is that intelligent people tend to be more depressed or more like this is widely or cynical or both, and this is widely like
More disappointed with reality.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. So first of all, I really don't know whether that is true or not. Like I'm asking because I mean it's a popular saying, but I'm not sure how much ground there is to that. And second, how much the two correlates, or if they don't correlate at all.
Let me give you the you want to?
No, please, Marco.
Okay, so here's the big picture, and this is a very interesting question because the answer actually changes depending on how close you look. So I'm going to give you like a question that's in let's say Russian dolls. At the very broadest levels of analysis, what you find is that low intelligence actually correlates with more psychopathology and mental disorders overall, to the point that people in psychopathology, so people working on mental disorders, you try to develop these models to classify and sort out the. One thing that people should be aware of is the rule in mental disorder is comorbidity, which means that if you get a diagnosis, let's pick your diagnosis, let's say depression. Well, it's very unlikely for a person to just have depression. So most people with depression, with not just a bit of depression, but diagnosable depression, about half of them will have something else. Enough, they meet the criterion for some other diagnosis. Could be maybe a personality disorder. And half of those will have a third diagnosis. So maybe an eating disorder too. And maybe some kind of, so comorbidity is the rule. We spend the DSM, if you think of this classification system, they try to pinpoint the border between different disorders, but in reality, what happens is that people present with clusters of symptoms, and it's not that clear cut. So, which means that as for cognitive abilities, you can do factor analysis on these symptoms, and it turns out you can also find a general factor of psychopathology. So disorders tend to correlate with one another because, of course, there's this comorbidity kind of background signal. So people are describing right now psychopathology. A lot of work describing this. They're calling it the P factor, which is really in analogy with the G factor. So they're taking the inspiration from G and calling this P as this general predisposition to all sorts of mental disorders. Now, okay, on a statistical level and a very general, broad level, that is true. And what you find is that this P factor in psychopathology correlates with G. So if you look at both,
correlates negatively with G.
Negatively with G, which means lower intelligence, higher risk for psychopathology. Now, this is at the very broadest level, and not just G, like tested intelligence. In a few studies, they look at things like, indicator of neural integrity. And you can look at stuff, for example, the retina. Turns out, the retina is part of your brain, technically, and it's a neural structure. You can look at the integrity of the retina, and it gives you hints about the integrity of the brain connections more generally, and so forth. So they've done this. You can look at things like subtle indicators of neurological damage, and it also correlates with. It's really picking up speed right now, the idea that you have this general factor in mental disorders, and one component or correlate of that is low intelligence. Now, this is if you look at things from a very long distance. If you get closer, well, first thing is not all mental disorders have the same correlation with intelligence. And there's a couple that are where it's really strong. And the schizophrenia is most people know. So there's a pretty consistent pattern. People who get schizophrenia tend to be, statistically, that doesn't mean that there are some people who are very smart, very high IQ who get schizophrenia, but statistically, on average, there's about maybe 7-8 points of IQ lower than the general population, or match controls or whatever. So this is very robust. What people often don't know, so schizophrenia is, at least psychologists kind of know. And if you look at all the brain studies of schizophrenia, you find that it's associated with things like smaller brain size, the white matter, so the connections in your brain tend to be less. The integrity of those is a bit lower, so it matches. It's very consistent pattern. You find actually the same pattern, even a bit stronger in ADHD. So ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity. Now, again, overall, there's maybe average, some kind of 7-8 points of IQ lower than average population. The problem with that is ADHD, even more than schizophrenia, is incredibly diverse within. So there's, but I have a book on psychopathology. My proposal was that there might be actually one cluster of people who get an ADHD diagnosis where attention is really not the main problem. What they do have is low IQ, which is also manifested in, you know, lower ability to regulate behavior and to pay attention and so forth. And you might have other clusters of people with an ADHD diagnosis who don't have an IQ deficit. So when you start looking closer, you know, you see. So those are the two main things. Now, depression, like anxiety, depression, they're all, one thing they have in common in terms of personality is they're linked to emotional instability, which is also a broad personality factor. And emotional instability actually does have a little negative correlation with IQ. So, and let me state this carefully. So on average, with a lot of exceptions and variation, but on average, people who are, well, let's say more emotionally unstable also tend to have slightly lower intelligence on average, and vice versa. So people with lower intelligence tend to be a bit less emotionally stable. Now the correlation is, so on average, you would expect people with depression to also statistically be more likely than not to have a, you know, slightly lower IQ than higher. So that's actually the opposite of what the factoid says. So if you look at a broad population, you would find the opposite correlation. However, the correlation is, again, small. Yeah. Which means that first, you only notice if you take a really big sample of people. You're not going to notice, just look at people in your, say, acquaintances or so forth. And then there's another factor that kicks in, which is what Russell was, you know, alluding to, that people tend to live most of the times in social bubbles that are fairly strongly segregated by IQ. Just because, you know, you end up doing the same kind of, you know, whatever job and education and whatever, but it's pretty strong. So people don't, very few people, right, know enough people across the entire range of IQ and are familiar with them. So you know, if you are only, and I don't know what happens at the high end of IQ, there might be, I don't know. I'm saying I actually don't know if maybe people with really high IQ tend to be more depressed. Actually, I don't think so statistically, because we actually have some data and some studies on people with exceptionally high IQ, right? Which, like, you know, really kind of not geniuses, but, or maybe by some definitions, but, you know, and we've been followed up throughout development and tracked, you know, into adulthood. And a lot of people expect, if you take just a bunch of children who are exceptionally smart and follow them through, you will find a lot of just weird people with all sorts of mental problems and stuff, right? That's the expectation of other people. They're going to be strange and weird. And on the contrary, on average, they tend to be, you know, have better mental health than average. So it's possible that when people catch on these patterns, they're really catching, you know, on examples that just stand out. When you have a person who, say, exceptionally smart, and also they are not well, you know, in a, for example, in personality sense, so they have some kind of weird disorder, you just notice more because they're like, they're so high functioning in some areas, and then they happen to. So it might be just the case that this kind of, you know, let's say people who are exceptionally smart and also have mental disorders, they just stand out more because it's, but on average, statistically, I would say the opposite is true. Now, let's go back to the psychopathology. I just wanted to.
Can I just ask one quick question?
Go ahead.
Because I'm really interested in this.
But what about serial killers?
No. What about really intense people who some people say are more detached from reality in a sense because they are so intelligent, so that they start sort of turning everything around them into sort of very logical things that just occur to them, and so maybe emotionally they seem less reactive to certain things. Like I was watching some documentary on, I think it was Thomas Mann and, you know, Einstein and Picasso and just like a few of these like super intelligent people, and they all seem to have this interesting thread of having sort of bad personal relationships with people because they seem quite detached from day to day and from reality and from these sort of emotional ups and downs. So I was wondering whether that had anything to do with this fact that they tend to be sort of more emotionally balanced, and so maybe it comes off as them just being completely detached from reality in a sense. Sorry, you're muted.
Okay. Yeah, no, I have been muted, rightly so. I was saying,
Julia, you're muted.
You are
Amazing.
muted.
Great. Sorry, I muted you because there was a tiny bit of feedback. I'm really sorry. Sorry for that.
Yeah, it's fine. So I would say, so okay, again, on it, and Russell can, you know, chime in maybe, but as far as I understand, you really need to, you know, to study a decent sample size of that to know what's happening. And again, I think on average the opposite is true. So you know, there's just a surprising finding that if you just select people, instead of looking for, you know, waiting until you find someone who's kind of stands out because they are, you know, super smart and also strange, let's say, you actually take a bunch of people who are super smart and then you follow them. Most of them tend also to be, you know, well-adjusted, you know, funny and socially skilled and whatnot. However, there is a little exception here, which is, and again, that's one of the main things that doesn't quite fit with that model I was talking about in terms of this, you know, general psychopathology factor that includes low intelligence and so forth. So that's especially true of some disorders, and, you know, schizophrenia and ADHD is probably the two main things. Then there's a little signal for things like anxiety disorders and depression because of this emotional instability connection there. But then you do have some disorders where the pattern is a bit different. And one of them is people who are in the psychosis spectrum, but you can think of the spectrum of psychosis as something that includes, on one hand, on one end of it, you have schizophrenia, especially what's called with negative symptoms, which is not as much, say, delusions and hallucinations, but the, you know, emotional detachment and the, you know, interaction problems and so forth. That is where you find the strongest association with lower IQ. Then if you move toward psychosis with more, say, hallucinations and delusional ideations and so forth, without those negative symptoms, then it improves. And then people who are mostly in the bipolar side of the spectrum, which means, you know, you're bipolar, manic, depressive, or especially people who tend to be more manic than depressed. There's some evidence that people who tend to be manic and bipolar, they are on average more intelligent than average. So that's one thing. And it doesn't quite fit with this general P factor model. The other exception is autism. Autism, which is weird.
High functioning autism.
Right. Because and that's what's weird about autism. It's, if you take people with a diagnosis of autism as a category, the average IQ is going to be lower. Partly because to get a diagnosis, in many cases, you need to be compromised. You know, you need to have all sorts of, you know, enough problems in your life that this will include a lot of people with low intelligence. But there's two things to. First, the spectrum of autism extends well into people with average and even above average intelligence. And the other thing that's been a big surprise, I think, that the one big surprise of the genetic studies of mental disorders is that there's some components of genetic risk for autism which overlap with the same genes that predict higher IQ. So generally, if you look at schizophrenia, for example, broadly speaking, on average, the genetic signal that predicts a higher risk of schizophrenia overlap with the genetic variance that predicts lower IQ. which makes sense, you know. But for autism, especially the common variants that predispose people for autism, there's a mild positive correlation with IQ. And there's even some theories, which I think have some merit, that that see autism as a kind of byproduct of recent natural selection on increased brain size and increased intelligence. And the idea there is that you have, you know, and what happens when you have strong selection over a relatively short time, and we've had that. I mean, if you look at human like brain size, there's been a period of time in which brain size has just, you know, exponentially increased, just goes up like that. What happens if you select for traits in that way is that you will pick up all sorts of variants that, you know, do what you want to do, let's say, you know, increase intelligence, but they're also going to have side effects.
Yeah.
And it can take quite a long time for selection to get rid or modify the genetic interactions in a way that you only keep the, let's say, the desirable traits and get rid of the downsides. So there's one idea that just autism as a disease, at least the high functioning part, is kind of the price we pay for this massive selection on brain size and intelligence. And it does fit with the fact that the genetic signal for autism overlaps with higher IQ. And I think that might be the only mental disorders where, at least as far as I know, where the evidence is reliable. You don't see that in the category because autism as a diagnostic category includes all sorts of things, including a lot of people with very low intelligence. So on average, it doesn't show up.
If I can chime in and add, I agree completely with what you're saying, Marco. One that I have seen replicated is a positive correlation between IQ and anorexia or bulimia. Right. So that's another exception. And in the US, those do tend to be middle and upper class disorders, and they appear in educated families. But yeah, if you zoom out and you say, okay, do people with a psychological diagnosis have lower IQs than average? Then the answer is yes. But the same is true for physical health. And so then the question becomes, well, is that true for every diagnosis? Are there diagnoses where it's more true for than others? And for both physical and mental health, the answer is no, it's not true for every diagnosis. There are some conditions that are more common in high IQ people or less common, and you've done a good job pointing those out. And I want to tie this back to what Maria Paula said about the idea of the emotionless, detached genius. Maybe that is partially a result of this genetic commonality that autism has with high IQ. And maybe part of being, I'm saying like super high IQ, 2, 3, 4, 5 standard deviations above average, is that maybe you don't have full-blown autism symptoms, but maybe you have autism-like tendencies of not being terribly interested in what people think or care about. And then lo and behold, these people get married at lower rates, they have children at lower rates, et cetera, et cetera.
Let me tell you one more thing. If you are super smart and also socially skilled, you will probably adapt to people around you and not make them stupid. It's kind of half joking but half serious. Actually, you wouldn't, if you just imagine a person who was talking to you was incredible, like in top few percent of IQ and also very socially skilled, you probably won't notice as much if you're less smart than they are because they're going to, accommodate you. A person
like Elon Musk,
keep going, right? And they will just, so you will stand out more. So serial killers.
There we go.
There's a similar.
I was about to say, sorry, Marco. I just wanted to chip in. So I got plenty of examples of that actually, because I was thinking fictional examples are real example. One fictional example that I'm watching the season 3 now for the 4th time. I'm actually suggesting to my partner to watch it. Is Rick from Rick and Morty. I'm not sure if you guys will watch the show on Netflix. He's absolute genius. But real example of what you're talking about is like, someone who's one person that gives me an idea of being super intelligent and also super skilled is Elon Musk, for example. Like, he clearly has very high social skill and he's clearly super intelligent. Like, let alone whatever is done with his companies. We're talking about a guy who was 12 years old, programmed a video game and sold it. Like, that's on another level. Anyway, yeah, sorry. Back to serial killer.
Yeah. Oh, well, I was just to kickstart. Again, you want to look first, like at the broad patterns, and then see if you can, what's going on there.
Well, first of all, it's true that they're super intelligent.
Well, that's the point. That's where I'm getting. So let me. I'm going to say a couple of things. So the first is, well, the background. There's some background personality traits again, and you want to think in this case about psychopathy. And there's a little conundrum there, because in the DSM there's also something called the antisocial personality disorder, and probably most serial killer would get a diagnosis of that just for free. But now antisocial personality disorder includes a lot of behavioral things like breaking the law and being impulsive and stuff like that. Now that kind of constellation of traits also correlates with lower IQ. If you only look though about psychopathy defined a bit more narrowly in terms of these personality traits of, say, the charming, superficial charm and lack of remorse and lack of empathy, now you still find a small negative correlation with IQ, but it's much, much smaller, which I think is like minus 0.10 for those who like these kind of numbers. But it's very small, which means that, again, there's a lot of variation at the extremes. Which means that there's definitely potential for people who are highly psychopathic and highly intelligent. And actually, that's the basis for what's called the successful psychopaths, which mean people who are, diagnosable as psychopaths, but they're not in prison. They can be highly successful, professionals, and they go to, surgery or other, law enforcement, or become lawyer. I mean, hey, wait a minute. But there's a bunch of professions in which you can actually, get a lot of satisfaction in terms of being a bit, taking advantage of people or in a socially acceptable way. Now, one thing you have to think about when you think about serial killers as being smarter or less smart, again, based on this data, you would predict that on average, you would get a lower IQ for people who have these antisocial traits and so forth. However, to be a serial killer means that you have to keep going without getting caught. Which means that there might be a bunch of people who kind of are just not very successful serial killer, and they get caught. You see what I mean?
And that's one of the difficulties with studying serial killers, is that by definition, they have to murder. In the US, the definition is at least 3 times in separate events, with a cool-off period between. Well, we don't know if that person who's caught the first time and put away for life is a serial killer who just got unlucky the first time.
Or not very competent.
Or not very competent. And so we can only study serial killers who are good at what they do to meet the definition, but not so good that they never get caught. And I'm skeptical about how representative of a sample this is. And my gut says that probably most people who could be serial killers probably get caught after the first or second murder.
I never thought about that. That's super fascinating.
So there's a very strong survivorship bias in this one.
So because basically, I actually did a course, a summer school course in America on criminal psychology, because I'm really interested in serial killers. And we were told to read this book called Mindhunter that now Netflix has made into a series, but it's actually originally a book, and it was written by the people who basically set up the behavioral unit in Quantico that then did thousands of interviews with serial killers in order to then archive the modus operandi of all the serial killers and all that kind of stuff, to have a database and then be able to sort of catch serial killers more easily. And what I thought was really interesting is that one of the differentiating factors, for example, between different types of serial killers is that some were socially completely built into their neighborhood, for example, or you know, some of them were married with kids, some of them had a stable job. So I'm just wondering, is that part of them trying to adapt into society and seem like they're more adapted and not get caught for longer? Or is it because some of them might just have those different personality traits or have a different level of IQ that then allows them to also sort of socially interact with other people and have a stable social life?
I'm uncertain again, because I'm just so skeptical because of that survivorship bias. You know, and there is the old joke that, you know, a serial killer blends in, and so, you know, if you want to dress up for Halloween, just dress normally, and you're a serial killer. I'm just so skeptical. My gut says that with modern technology, and everything, it's just so easy to catch them the first or second time. And I bet a lot of people who don't blend in are just caught earlier. And so, you know, the ones who do have a stable life, you know, the big one that got headlines recently, I was caught in the United States, was the Golden State Killer, who stopped killing for over 30 years before he was caught, and had a wife and kids and worked the same job for years. And I think we get that impression just because of the survivorship bias. If they all looked, you know, if this subgroup really didn't blend in, they might not make it to their second or third murder. You know, for all we know, a lot of people could become serial killers, but they stupidly murder a friend or a coworker or a parent the first time, and it's really easy to catch them. No, how do serial killers keep going? They murder people on the fringes of society, like prostitutes and homeless people. You know, that's where most serial killers really rack up their total. But maybe the smarter ones target random victims, and maybe they're better at hiding it. So I'm skeptical whether you can really generalize to all the population of people who could have become serial killers and the population of people who could be eventually caught. I'm skeptical.
But I think it's an interesting, in a way, it's kind of a fascinating test case for a lot of the stuff we've been talking about today, because it's, you know, talking about these psychological, you know, patterns. There's one thing is that the overall pattern can go one direction, and then you have interesting subgroups that go in the opposite direction. If the correlations are kind of in the small range, there's enough range there to get all sorts of interesting patterns. And the other thing I would say is that sometimes just looking at the end point is not enough to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
That applies to serial killers, but also say, you know, geniuses, or what happens in education, or with socioeconomic status and intelligence. Sometimes you get a lot of, you know, wrong ideas just by looking at the endpoint, and you don't realize how much, say, selection there's been to get to that point. You know, maybe you need some kind of unusual circumstances to get there. You see what I mean? And the broader pattern might well be the opposite of what you see in a particular case. So I think it's actually a great, you know, a great example to sum up a lot of the strangeness and the kind of counterintuitive stuff we've been
And I'll bet you anything that if we could get that good sample and we didn't just look at the endpoint, again, going by a gut feeling, we know that people who do end up in prison for violent offenses have lower IQ than average. Depending on the sample in the country, it's about 4 to 7 points below average. So it's not a remarkably lower degree. And so if I think, okay, if serial killers are a subset, if caught serial killers are a subset of this larger group, then, probably I would say that being a serial killer might make you more likely to have a lower IQ, but maybe they're just the exceptions because the correlation's not perfect. And so I'm willing to entertain that, especially for the ones who go long periods of time without getting caught. I'm waiting for more details to come out about, the Golden State Killer. He only pled guilty a couple months ago, but I'm dying to find out more details about his life because my gut says he's probably pretty smart. I do know that he graduated from college. My bet is his IQ is at least 5, if not 10 or 15 points above average.
There you go.
Interesting.
Do you have any predictions for the future when it comes to intelligence? Like, what do you believe?
Open question.
Yeah.
You wrote the book, man.
Yeah, I wrote the book. I think we are going to have more breakthroughs, especially in the neuroscience of intelligence and in the genetics of intelligence. I think the biology of intelligence has the potential to have more breakthroughs in the next 10 years than at any other time since the research on this topic began. Giulio, people in neuroscience like you, you're the ones making the exciting breakthroughs. The testers like me, we made our breakthroughs 80 years ago, 90 years ago.
Yeah, we had this conversation with Maria on a number of occasions because essentially one movie is a blockbuster movie, but one movie that I found extremely fascinating is Matrix, the first one. Mm-hmm. And the reason is a very nerd reason to find it fascinating, but essentially it's, something that nobody noticed really is that I always quote an example because if we had a deep knowledge of if we had a technology so advanced and we had a deep knowledge of how neurons encode for synaptic plasticity and transmission, we could literally recreate the Matrix. So someone could live an entire life. I'm not joking. Like, this is what, like, theoretically that is possible. That's what is really worrying about that. Practically speaking, the technology, like, yeah, you could put a micro electrode, like really micro electrodes in the spinal cord of some individual at the level of the skull base, and you can literally do that. The problem is that obviously the technology is not there. We don't know if it's ever going to be there, obviously, it's like, to say that it's complicated is cheaping, like the way it's cheaping how complicated this could be. On the other hand, speaking about Elon Musk, I found fascinating this Neuralink and this computer interface research that he's doing. And there is this talk. I mean, it obviously needs to sell the product. Let's not forget about that. So clearly, there is a lot of, it's spun a lot. But there is this talk about enhancing human intelligence artificially, and I'm fascinated by it. I am cautious about that as well. Like, I'm skeptical, like you tend to be skeptical. Like, I'm not sure we're ever going to be in a situation where, I want to learn how to be a pilot. Let's put an electrode in my head, and in 5 minutes, I am there. I'm not sure we're ever gonna get to the point. That's my those are my really humble 2 cents about it. But I would be very happy to be proven wrong. That would be amazing.
But I think if I could add, I think what Neuralink is trying to do, at least for the foreseeable future, is to just increase the human bandwidth. I don't think at the moment it has anything to do with actually increasing IQ. I think it just has to do with basically making sure, because I mean, and I was talking to Giulio about this because I thought it was really funny. The company motto is, if you can't beat them, join them. Because he basically wants to prevent AI taking over. And so what he's thinking short term is, our main issue, if we have sort of sentient AI, is going to be the fact that they're going to be a lot faster at doing things. So I think Neuralink, as a first step, what it's trying to do is just increase this bandwidth that we have, so that instead of having, for example, if I want to send someone a message, I need to pick up my phone, I need to type it, I need to send it. It's immediate because I can connect to someone else's brain in a sense, and they will just know what I'm thinking, right? So I do think that for the sort of short-term plans of Neuralink, that's mainly what he's trying to do. But it would be interesting to know if it's possible. I mean, that was actually one of the main things that I was interested in, and if we could answer it in sort of this part of the question, I am interested in understanding whether in the future something like Neuralink could ever actually increase that base level genetic that we have ever, even if it's just through this increase of bandwidth.
I don't know. I mean, this is science fiction.
Our favorite.
Yes. I don't know how much technological enhancement, at least within my lifetime, will be possible. But my view is that whatever advances we make in psychology, in neuroscience, in technology, in cybernetics, in relation to intelligence, are more likely to improve the world for humanity than it is to make it worse. I know people are afraid of the AI bots taking over. There's fear of a Brave New World, of the Borg or whatever. I look at this and I say, look, everything that we've done to improve people's problem solving has made the world better. Exactly. We've never been able to feed as many people, care for as many people, provide education for as many people, and make as many people's lives better as humanity can right now. And so if we do find a way to make people smarter, I only see the benefits being a net plus.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right.
Let me add one. Again, this is so we're really in science fiction territory, so who knows? But as just a counterpoint to, let me give you, I have a paper where just for the references and and links, but on cognitive trade-offs in cognition, and the idea that you can't have all that you want. So sometimes improving some things will interfere with something else or reduce some other features of the system. And there's a couple of things that you want to maybe think about in terms of artificially enhancing, right, human intelligence. One would be, well, it's I don't know, the Neuralink. Honestly, I don't know the details of what they're trying to do, and it just sounds a bit hyped. But the idea of increasing the bandwidth, now that's very interesting because there's a whole branch of research on cognitive, like problem solving and decision making, where what it turns out is that you can solve some problems better and perform better in real world situations by actually narrowing the bandwidth, by actually excluding a lot of information and focusing on a few bits of information that actually matter more or give you more reliable heuristics. And then Gerd Gigerenzer, for those who are interested, is the kind of the father of this. But the idea is that sometimes heuristics or reasoning strategies that actually discard most of the information and they act in so-called fast and frugal way can outperform more sophisticated strategies. So that's something to keep in mind, because the assumption that by increasing the bandwidth, increasing the amount of information you have in your, let's say, short-term memory or whatever, you always increase performance. That might not be the case. The other thing is our brain is probably, okay, let me put it this way. Part of the reason, there's some reason why we're not smarter that have to do with just limitations of, say, natural selection, or, so for example, mutations in the brain, in brain expressed genes, and that is probably the part that's easier to improve in a sense, because when you identify the rare mutations, but every person has a bunch of those, right? So let's say correcting mutations could be the easiest way to affect intelligence, could actually give you a boost without even understanding what they do, to be honest. But when you think of improving the system as a whole, one reason why our brain is not, say, more efficient at doing things could just be because there are safeguards in place. And I mean all sorts of protection against, for example, error. I mean, it's easy to make some, if you do like artificial intelligence, let me give you one example here. Neural networks, which are pretty cool and impressive, and they, can at this point probably outperform humans in some tasks, like identifying pictures or stuff like that. Now, they perform very well, but what people are finding out now is that they're very brittle. It's you probably came across, I mean, that's an example that many people know, that some neural networks that are very good at recognizing objects. Like, this is a cat, this is a banana, this is whatever. And then you change one pixel in the picture and they go completely off track. Yeah. And there's a cat with one pixel that's been changed strategically and they think it's a banana. Now what's happening there is that's a system that's, where performance comes at a cost in terms of robustness and ability to correct errors and to be resistant to. And our brains have millions of years of history in which we have to protect ourselves against, errors, false perceptions, manipulation from other people, manipulations from probably even parasites and like viruses and other. So it's likely that our brain pay a price of efficiency, but in a way that makes us actually more resistant to all sorts of bad consequences. And as we, move towards a neural technology that tries to expand this range of possibilities, we're going to find out there might be, ways to tweak our brains and make them better at some things that it might come at a cost, if part of the inefficiency is due to redundancy and robustness and so forth. And this is what artificial intelligence is actually dealing with now. There's been a few years in which there was tremendous progress made in making this, for example, these neural networks that are incredible, perform so much better than they used to, and you get this high performance out of them. But when you want to deploy them in, say, a critical application where, like, say, driving a car or driving something, or then that's way much harder to do, because then you have all these problems that kick in and robustness becomes a priority. And one thing that might, it's not a prediction, it's just a possibility, is that people in AI will find that to prevent this kind of error and make the system more robust, you have to sacrifice performance to some extent. And I suspect that our brains are doing that a lot. A lot of inefficiency that's not just, lack of optimization, but actually protection from errors and mistakes and manipulation and all sorts of things. If that's true, then there might be some interesting limits to what you can do. Or maybe the way we do, usually we've done this other times, we build technologies that create other problems, and then we solve the problems with more technology. So that's, we're pretty good at doing this kind of thing. And so maybe but it might be harder to solve some of these problems than it appears, just thinking that the brain is, it's just, not optimized enough. Well, there might be some reasons for that. And then again, if people are interested in that, I actually have a paper where I talk a little bit about that on trade-offs and point to some nice work.
Perfect. Thank you, Marco.
Thank you, Marco.
There's a lot of Just give me 1 sec. Here we go. Sorry, I had a massive echo. Sorry, guys. I think we kept you long enough. It's been super, super interesting. Thank you very much for being here. We got one final question. This one is only for Russell, because we asked you, Marco, already before when we came to the spotlight. This is a question that we ask to pretty much every guest that comes. Is a 2 points question. So first of all, what kind of book would you recommend for the summer to anyone who's listening to us, other than yours? That's and most importantly, which is also more interesting probably, what is the book that changed your life, if you have to pick up one?
Oh gosh. Well, for summer reading, the best non-fiction science scholarly book I've read recently, and I blogged about it, is called In Reckless Hands by Victoria Nourse, Nourse. I picked it up thinking it was going to be a scholarly discussion of the legal issues in the early 20th century in the United States surrounding eugenics, but it reads like a novel. Someone needs to make a mini series or a movie about it. I mean, it has everything from colorful populist politicians to government officials subverting the official line and jailbreaks. I mean, it reads like a novel. So whether you're interested in history of science and genetics, or just want a page turner that's completely true in every word, that's a really good summer read. And it's only, I think the ebook version was only about 130 pages or so. No more than that, but it's got to be more than that. But it just reads so fast, I couldn't put it down. I was like, wow, science book that reads like a novel. It doesn't happen often. Oh, book that's changed my life. That one's much harder because there's several.
You can say several if you want.
I can say several. With my professional life, I think, and unfortunately I can't tell you the author, but when I was a teenager, I checked out a book about the brain from the library, and I just thought it was the most interesting thing. I probably read it 3 times. I'm sure it'd be incredibly outdated today now. But just in general, being exposed to psychology and the brain set me on this professional path. So I'm sorry I don't have the exact title. I feel bad. I've sometimes wondered, but if you search for like book about the brain in the 90s, you're not going to find that in particular. For my personal research, probably the book I've cited the most in my scholarly work is The G Factor by Arthur Jensen, published in 1998. And boy, does that thing hold up well. I hope my new books holds up that well over 20 years later. Still very citable, little dense in places. From a personal perspective, in my personal life, I'm a devout Christian, devout Latter-day Saint, and so the Bible and the Book of Mormon would definitely have changed my life. I served a 2-year mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and so those have definitely changed my life. And so, hard to pick just one. I really can't overstate how much I love reading classic literature too. Funny that all of you, with being Italians, asked me to come on. I'm already rereading the Decameron right now, and so
I'm a massive fan.
Yes,
I love it.
yes.
Love it, yeah.
I've read
that's
that
impressive.
before.
Yes, I don't think I ever heard anyone from outside Italy knowing that book. That's
impressive.
I
love it. It is such a good book. But I'm also reading Shakespeare sonnets and stuff. So I love classic Western literature. And so it's really hard to just nail down one thing. I think if you only read one genre, you're boring.
I wonder how it's translated in English, the Decameron, because it's such a, like in Italian, it's such a specific Italian, like, it's a very peculiar version of Italian, actually, Well,
yeah, I don't speak Italian, but English that old, most people can't read 14th century English either. So I'm sure there's a lot of modernization. I'm sure it loses some of the flavor and the cadence of the language, but the humor comes through. It's
cool.
The frame story is boring, but the 100 stories themselves are just. I'm rereading that right now. I'm just having a blast. I forgot how fun it was.
Yeah, it's a great book. I love it. Exactly. Like my mom would be proud of me because she's a high school teacher, and actually she teaches Italian literature and Latin, and she's a great she's a great admirer of the work of well.
I'm a little bit of an Italophile. I told Marco that I named one of my children Dante. So I mean, I've got my Italian file credentials. You can trust me.
Thank you very much. I got another question in mind now, but I think it's a question for another topic, for another episode entirely, which is about intelligence and religion. And I would say religion and more than intelligence, I would say religion and mental pathways, if you want, like mental neural pathway. But that's a topic for another episode. In fact, actually, you gave me an idea. We could stage another episode with a few neuroscientists.
I'd love to be back.
You guys included. It would be great. It would be great. Thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who has been listening to us today. And we are really, really proud of this episode. I must confess, it's like, very high quality content. And, we feel super privileged to have had this discussion with you guys. And thank you very much. And we really hope that you enjoyed it as well. And you're going to be back.
Fantastic.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Just give me 1 second. Possiamo switchare in italiano. Quick housekeeping.
Okay.
There you go. Sorry, I was replying to someone. Housekeeping, sì, switchiamo in italiano? Adesso solo per la chiusura?
Sì, ok. Vai.
Molto rapidamente, ricordatevi di seguirci per le puntate future su Spotify, Apple Podcast, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and che cosa abbiamo che bolle in pentola? Yes, abbiamo grandi cose in realtà che bollono in pentola. Possiamo annunciare che dici il 14 febbraio già o ce lo teniamo? Il 13 febbraio.
Magari aspettiamo.
Aspettiamo, ok. Allora, però possiamo dire una cosa. Allora, la prossima settimana avrete un grosso ritorno al pub del lunedì sera. Qualcuno che è stato, un esponente politico molto in vista che torna. Ecco, posso dirvi questo.
E poi molto velocemente ne abbiamo anche organizzata una per il 27 che secondo me sarà veramente incredibile. Nella quale parleremo di religione, tecnologia e di UFO.
Esattamente, con un ospite che viene direttamente dal podcast di Lex Freeman, che è uno dei nostri modelli di riferimento.
Esatto.
Quindi direi grazie a tutti, ricordatevi di seguirci su tutti i nostri canali e alla prossima. Buona serata.
Grazie a tutti, ciao.